I've, thought about this a lot, and it's quite true. When I wrote that book, Rumi was almost unknown in the West. I mean, only Orientalists and people really interested in this Persian literature, and of course, there weren't many, knew about him, even though the whole Masnavi was available. And there's a history, of course. But in any case, and now, as you say, he's very popular. Let me just recall an anecdote. Probably about 15 years ago, I was invited to the Smithsonian Institute to give a talk on Rumi, right? I mean, that's, Washington, D.C., Smithsonian. I said, well, okay. 4 lectures over 8 hours, with breaks and all that, and question and answer. So I went. I had about 100 people attending, and I think they paid for it. So they were serious. And one of the questions came up, what do you think about the translations of Coleman Barks? So I said, well, let me put it this way. As a Persian speaker, and someone familiar with Rumi, I can't read his translations because I'm familiar with the original and I get very upset. But if it were not for Coleman Barks, I would not have more than 2 people in this audience. So he is doing a great service. He's opening the door for people, and who knows, if they follow up on it, they may indeed reach someplace. So that's the way I look at it.
And I'm curious, yeah, that's a very, very interesting point. And obviously, 40 years later, like you said, Rumi is somewhat of a household name, and pop stars are naming their children Rumi and getting his, popular versions tattooed on their arms. Um, Obviously, having sat with Rumi, and this is somewhat a, playful and hypothetical, what do you think Rumi would make of his popularity in the contemporary postmodern West?
Oh, I think we just laugh. It was very amusing. He had a great sense of humor. You would see the irony in this. All these people uh, caught up with really what he would call metaphorical love, and they think that he's speaking to them. Well, he is,
Mhm.
and maybe he isn't. So I think he would just be amused.
Would you say that obviously there are so many great scholars and Sufis and masters of the intellectual tradition and poets, but Rumi has become so much more popular than anyone else. I'm curious if you might reflect on his intellectual milieu. Do you think it had something to do with the fact that he lived in a more multicultural environment, or he was speaking to different types of people, or even maybe his feeling, his calling to speak beyond the scholarly milieu? Any thoughts you have on that, of why Rumi would speak so across tradition and so universally?
Uh, it, it has everything to do with the audience. Rumi Rumi's poetry can be understood, and especially in those days, could be understood by any Persian speaker. It was not necessary to be literate to understand Rumi. Just the language. He's speaking with imagery, which is very down to earth, everyday imagery. He's talking to everyone. I'm sure he had many disciples, maybe very advanced disciples, who didn't know how to read. They could recite the Quran enough to say their prayers, but no. So who is he speaking to? The common people, put it that way. Now, scholars who pick themselves say, Rumi. No. Again, an anecdote. This one I heard from one of my teachers, a philosopher, a great philosopher in Iran. And he's told me he heard this from his teachers. So, it goes back. One day, Rumi was sitting together with Sadruddin Ghunavi. Sadruddin Ghunavi, of course, was contemporary, was a very close friend of Rumi, is the foremost disciple of Ibn Arabi, How do we know Ibn Arabi? Because of Sadruddin Qunabi. All of our modern perception or later perception of Ibn Arabi goes through Sadruddin Qunabi. And his writing is even more difficult than Ibn Arabi, who's no slouch when it comes to difficulty. So Qunabi is an amazing, but who's he talking to? He's not talking to the common people. He's not even talking to the scholars. He's talking to the elite of the elite, the most educated, the most subtle of Islamic scholars. That's the audience for his books. He only has 8 or so compared to his teacher. This is a drop in the bucket, but they're very, very dense. Now, so Rumi and Sadruddin Qunabi are sitting together at the head of the room. Of course, Rumi's disciples are in this. Many of them are there. This is the Khanaqah, the Zawiya, everyone is welcome. And so the two sheikhs are talking together. And then one of Rumi's disciples comes forward. He raises his hand. Ya sheikh. He says, yes, what is it? I have a very pressing question. May I ask it? He says, oh, yeah, of course. Come. So this disciple comes forward, asks Rumi this question. Sadruddin is observing. Rumi immediately, off the top of his head, answers the question, and the disciple in his eyes, oh, thank you, Sheikh. Now backs off, kissing the floor. All right. Sadruddin Qunabi looks through Rumi and he says, oh, no, I don't know how you do that. The most difficult, complicated metaphysical issues. You put them in the simplest language. It is a marvel. Maulana Rumi turns to Sadruddin and says, Lana, what are you talking about? The marvel is you. You take the simplest ideas and turn them into the most complicated metaphysics. Now, this is a very, very good statement of the difference between Rumi and the whole school of Ibn Arabi as it was developing. And of course, the two moved together. This teacher I'm talking about was a philosopher. He also, of course, loved Rumi. He listened to music all the time. There was, in the later tradition, there was no contradiction, but they understood very well that Rumi speaks to everyone. Doesn't matter what your religion is. That's irrelevant because you don't have to know anything about your religion. Sadruddin Qunabi speaks to the elite of the elite. Ibn Arabi speaks to those. This is why, of course, in Islamic history, and we were talking about this the other day, many of the sheikhs forbade their disciples from reading Ibn Arabi. But in private, they would teach Ibn Arabi to their elite disciples because Ibn Arabi is too much. It's dangerous. If you take, anyway. So they're just two very, very different ways of approaching the tradition. They agree on, I would say, everything, but their language is extremely different.